Well, Armored Core 6 hasn't been out for very long, and people are already taking issue with one of the very early skill checks in the game, many asking for an easy mode or being very critical of their decision to do this. It's actually not abnormal for FromSoft to have these types of skill checks early in a game or elements of the game that you really need to get past in order for it to click. For me, and many, it was Madame Butterfly in Sekiro. For others, it's just that moment where you finally beat a boss or an early stage of the game where you just are sort of beating your head against it, and then you manage to get past it. Well, I want to look at an article from Sportskeeda where they say, need a difficulty option. After Elden Ring, some players now want difficulty settings in Armored Core 6. Now, before we look at that, I do want to talk about the fact that, in general, I think Elden Ring may be causing some of this. They may be sort of setting themselves up with the way that they allowed for more people, I think, to beat Elden Ring than maybe in the past had felt they could beat a FromSoft game, and it was summoning. My first playthrough through Elden Ring, I had a very strong summon, Tiche, or however you say it, and basically that summonable person was beating bosses for me. That's so strong, splitting aggro, the boss is sort of paying attention to your summon and not to you, and able to do large amounts of damage. That may be setting FromSoft up for this type of criticism to increase going forward. Maybe people are going to expect some sort of an inroad, some sort of a catalyst of approachability so that they can come into the game and play it. And from very early on, I was confident that Armored Core was going to be very, very tough. The guy who was in charge of directing and combat in Sekiro was basically in charge of this game, so I expected, him to bring the stagger and the speed, and you got to kind of stay on top of the boss, and we're seeing some of that met out in some of the player feedback from the community. And I do think that that's always going to be a challenge when you make games that are this difficult, is your vision for the game is meant to be one where you fail a lot, and have to go back and start over. Somebody from my community that is regularly beating FromSoft games rather quickly got stuck on the early check against one of the bosses and spent like an hour and a half and kept going back and changing their build, then finally beat it. I had somebody say that they got stuck in the same spot, and when they finally got the right build, they got through the entire fight and never had to heal once. So there is certainly not just a skill check in Armored Core 6, but a knowledge check as well, and that is one aspect of the game that's probably going to frustrate people. So let's take a look here at what people are saying. We've got some tweets, we've got some responses, and I just kind of want to interact with them. And it says here, Armored Core 6 is the latest FromSoftware title. The Mecha Battler is the first of its kind for the current generation consoles and PCs, following the release of Armored Core Verdict Day back in 2013. Being the newest entry in the franchise, the game has had several refinements and changes to its overall combat system, with many players critiquing the Souls-like mechanics it draws inspiration from. Now, I want to kind of go back and reminisce with all of the people that said this game was going to be too easy. Do you remember that? When the hardcore Armored Core fans were saying that the game had been casualified because there was a hard lock in the game. Well, I really don't think that anybody playing this game is walking away from it and saying that it has been casualified or that it is easy. It is delivering exactly what many of us expected, which is an absolutely brutal and very difficult game to play. So let's just continue reading. I just found that to be amusing in light of the fact that the dialogue leading up to this was a lot of people saying it was going to be too easy or casualified. In particular, a large section of players have been quite vocal about the difficulty option in Armored Core 6, and they've taken to social media to voice their frustrations. You can see here on the official Armored Core, Twitter account, it says, need a difficulty option. The first, quotation, boss is annoying, infuriating. Most games have a difficulty option. Might just uninstall and get a refund. I think the thing to keep in mind here is referencing most games. That's not really how we measure whether or not a game should do something. Most games do all sorts of things that don't necessarily fit with the artistic direction of another given game. If you look at the success of Baldur's Gate 3 as an example, turn-based games are not as popular as they used to be, and they're sort of making a resounding comeback, right? You can't look at a turn-based game and say, well, most games don't do turn-based. There was a time where you would say most games did turn-based, That doesn't mean that you look at a brand new game or a brand new RPG and say, well, this one should also do that. I think when it comes down to the developer's decision and their artistic vision for the game, that should dictate what happens. And I do think FromSoft is well within their right to say, look, we don't want that. Our vision is that this is the game, this is how hard it is, and the design philosophy is that you fail and figure out different builds and different approaches. That's where the satisfaction comes in. If you read the testimonials of people that are really enjoying Armored Core 6, you will find that is a very common theme. You will not find people that are like, oh, it was great, I beat most of the bosses my first try. Or, yeah, man, I'm such a hardcore Armored Core veteran that I'm just like skating through these fights. No, they seem to take a lot of their satisfaction in figuring out what the best build and combination is and going back, and that knowledge and experimentation yielding itself in very, very fast wins or, victories. Let's continue reading here, though, because more people are weighing in. Armored Core 6 community reacts to game difficulty with certain players asking for an easy mode. It would seem that a sizable portion of the player base is asking for an easy mode, citing the first boss to being too much of a challenge. Twitter user Lizardman asked developer FromSoftware to add in an easier difficulty mode, stating most games have a difficulty option. Well, when he said this, he got responses like, "Get good." And then this guy says, "But for real, use cover, slash with sword when possible, and just keep the pressure on." Now, I will say this. When I was playing Sekiro for the very first time, and people were telling me, you got to keep the pressure on Madame Butterfly, it didn't click for me. I didn't know, what do you mean keep the pressure on? She's fast. She's hitting me and slicing me up, and I'm getting really annoyed, right? Well, somebody finally said something, and it was like a light bulb went off in my head. And I felt bad for all of the people who had been trying to help me because what they said didn't help. I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. They're like, keep the pressure on, stay on top of her. And this one guy basically said, hit her until she deflects. And so I did that. And it was like everything clicked into place. And I beat her very shortly thereafter. That was sort of the puzzle piece I needed. Like it slid in perfectly and everything sort of lit up for me. And then from that point on, I had a pretty good time with Sekiro. Got very disappointed and discouraged. And my morale got very low in the last fight. And after 5 hours, I came away with a victory. And it's like one of my favorite games, right? That game sort of does something to you because it kind of convinces you that you're not going to win, right? Especially at the very, very end. But more and more people are weighing in, saying get good. Players on the Steam community forums have apparently been taking issue with the difficulty scaling, as cited here. They've also been quick to criticize the difficulty scaling. One user believes that having the first boss fight drop in without any warning or tutorial is unfair to new players. They go on to state that, quote, the game is hard for no reason and that many players will eventually end up refunding it. Well, I saw a hilarious review on Twitter from Metacritic. The guy gave it a 0, and I read it for, giggles during a member stream, and he said that he didn't like Sekiro. And I was like, well, then why did you buy Armored Core? Like, if you're familiar with these games and you've bought them before and you didn't like them, then what are you doing? Like, why would you buy a game that you don't enjoy? Like, here's my expectations with Armored Core 6. I likely will never be able to beat it or complete it because I don't really have the time for a game that requires that. That's okay. I'm happy with my purchase. I like supporting FromSoft. I like their games. I've gotten a lot out of them, even though I was disappointed with elements of the second half of Elden Ring. Sekiro's in the top 5 of all time for me of games that I've enjoyed, and maybe one day I will be able to go and enjoy Armored Core 6 and be able to take the time to tinker and lose for an hour and then finally kind of figure out what the build is that, to get past it. I don't like to play video games in the evenings that are going to be very stressful and frustrating. I usually play video games in the evenings for maybe an hour or less just to relax, right? It's not very relaxing for me. Now, for you, it might be. Maybe for you, it is. But for me, it's not. Like, it gets my adrenaline up. It raises my blood pressure. It really takes me there, which I think is an amazing experience. I really enjoy that at some levels, but I don't like that at the end of my day, before bed. So let's continue reading here. Another rather infamous thread on Steam forums critiqued the title, asking for a sub 80 rating. The reasons for it seem to be the troublesome first helicopter boss and lame vibes. This thread has since since been locked by the moderators but can still be accessed as an archive. Their responses mostly include other players ridiculing the person for their vague statement, citing a lack of skill on their part for losing to a tutorial boss. I hate to say it, and to make this person feel even worse, my wife doesn't play these games, and she beat the helicopter boss. Now, obviously, I was reaching over and tapping heal at just the right moments because I didn't want her to have to, like, pay attention to her health bar and hit one more button. But with my sort of guidance of, like, when to fight, when to get into cover, like, I was kind of helping her track the boss. She's not a gamer, right? So she's not able to, like, look at the radar and look at the health and look at this. She's able to get the basics down. And she was able to beat the helicopter tutorial boss that just kind of shows up out of nowhere. That's not even really the first boss that people are getting stuck on. Okay, that's the boss to just sort of introduce you to the game. There's a real first boss that's checking a lot of people, and you apparently can't even do PvP until you beat him. So I've not gotten that far. We played on a Friday night. I managed to beat the helicopter boss after, a couple of drinks and just kind of laughing. I was not in a tight, super attentive, mindset to whoop on a boss, and I got past the helicopter boss. So I really think that people need to consider when you get a game like this, you kind of have to let the game be the game on its own terms. Like, you can't ask the game to be something else. Continuing here, it says, thankfully, it seems that some civil discussions taking place within the forums. User Mr. Saturn requested that the entire community help newcomers to the series instead of gatekeeping them. I will be honest. My experience when I did my very first playthrough in Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro, I sort of felt that there were two realities about the FromSoft community. They're extremely helpful. They will maybe help you to a fault, and sometimes you don't want it. You're like, please stop backseat gaming. But other times I'm like, hey, man, thank you for the tip. I don't know what I'm doing. Thanks so much. Like when that guy was like, dude, hit her till she deflects. That was the moment that, like, Sekiro turned for me. So I was grateful to that person sort of backseat gaming. But they're also very protective. If you have anything critical to say of a FromSoft game, they will get very, very defensive. It is very much like their thing. It's not their religion, but for some of them, it's very close to that. And you got to be very careful if you're going to be critical of a FromSoft game, because they will come after you. But they are very helpful. So there is an element of jealousy that I feel. If I could dedicate once a week to playing Armored Core, maybe I'll think through that. Maybe we'll try it once and just see what the community response is. If they all pile in to be like, hey, let's help this total noob get through Armored Core. Could be good content. I'm not really known for gameplay, though, anymore. That's sort of taken a bit of a backseat unless we're showing something day one. I tend to be more of a talk show host, and we sort of run those talk shows Monday through Friday. So, in general, anytime this discussion comes up, I basically tell people that you have to let the artwork arrive on its own terms. It would sort of be like telling a heavy metal band that they really need to put some slow acoustic ballads on their album. They would be like, well, why? Well, it makes it more approachable. I can listen to it to relax and kind of calm down, and your music's really high energy and it's intense. Well, you're asking them to modify their art form to make it more approachable for your own subjective palette. And I do think that is something that is difficult for people to see, that's what you're actually requesting from FromSoft when you want an easy mode. Well, more people could play it. Well, is that really the hallmark of a good game, that just more people could play it? At what point do you say, well, this game is still without of reach of certain hemispheres of skill, right? Like, is there an age bracket? Like, my kiddos, I'm playing through It Takes Two with my son, and it's taking us a lot longer to get through the game than when I played through it with my wife, because he's 7, so he's having a harder time with certain things and certain timings, right? Well, at what point do you say, oh, make it easier, make it even easier than that, make it so where he can just literally push a button and his character does everything for him? There's always going to be a threshold where somebody gets left out. Somebody can't beat the boss or the level or the challenge. And that's why it's fair for some games to say our challenge level's way up here, and other games it's down here, and other games are like, hey, you can turn on what amounts to God mode and you can't die. I've turned that on for my kids in certain games like Ratchet & Clank or Chia, where it's basically like, yeah, you can't really die, just have fun exploring the world and doing the missions and the quests. And I think that's one of the greatest things about video games, that we have this level of diversity, and we have those games that if you beat it, it's a badge of honor, because you know nobody got past that boss without having to do essentially the same thing you did. And that's a great sense of satisfaction. And that's one of the reasons I think that FromSoft games are special in the history of video games. And missing out on that's okay, but don't ask it to become something else, because nobody's asking you to become something else. Like, we're not asking you to become a different type of gamer. Sometimes you just have to accept that you're the type of gamer that's not going to enjoy these types of games. So let me know what you think below. If you want to discuss this further, these videos typically roll over into a members-only debrief. Hit that join button. For $5, you can get into an entire month of my members-only content, as well as my members-only Discord. If you don't do memberships on YouTube, but you don't want to miss out on my content, hit the like button, hit subscribe and the bell button, and that way I can see you in the next video.